He reminds me of a dog that nobody wants.
I thought maybe she might not like it.
Well, I thought it might, help.
Do you remember the child stars who disappeared without saying goodbye? Just gone, like they were never there at all? In the 70s, these young actors lit up our living rooms, part of the rhythm of everyday life we trusted and loved. But behind the smiles and spotlight, what really happened when the cameras stopped? Do you remember Joni? The girl next door with the perfect ponytail and that spark in her voice that made every scene from Happy Days feel like home. Erin Moran played her like she was her. If you were a kid or teenager watching television in the late 1970s, chances are Joni was more than just a character to you. She was a kind of friend, someone who felt familiar. But what happened to her after the cameras stopped rolling? That is where the story turns quietly heartbreaking. Erin got her big break at just 13 years old, and she quickly became the face of family television. But here is the thing. When the lights dimmed on Happy Days, they never really came back on again for her. The spin-off Joni Loves Chachi never stuck the landing. And Hollywood, as it often does, moved on without looking back. It was like she vanished, not in the dramatic headline-making way, but in a softer, sadder fade. One day she was there, in reruns and cereal box covers, and the next? Just gone. No farewell tour, no goodbye special. Behind the scenes, Erin's life was unraveling slowly and painfully. Financial trouble, housing insecurity, and health issues became her real script. She was no longer the bubbly teenager in poodle skirts. She was an adult woman caught in a system that had no place for child stars who had grown older. Even when the media caught glimpses of her years later, it was not with curiosity or care, it was with judgment. And that silence from the industry? That was the loudest part of all. When she passed away in 2017 from cancer, it was the first time many people even realized she had been struggling for decades. The world finally said goodbye. But Erin never really got the chance to say hers, and that is the part that stays with you. The way someone so familiar, so present, can disappear right in front of us, and we never even notice until it is too late. There was something about Adam Rich. Maybe it was the bowl haircut, or the oversized sweaters, or that shy smile that made every parent want to adopt him and every kid want to be him. As Nicholas on 8 is Enough, he was America's youngest TV brother, small, sweet, and smart beyond his years. And then, just like that, he was gone. No press conference, no final role, just gone. Back in the 1970s, 8 is Enough was the kind of show that families planned their evenings around. It was appointment television, the emotional glue of the week. And Nicholas? He was the scene stealer, but Adam's real life was never as neatly wrapped as the episodes he starred in. The fame came early and heavy, and for a while it looked like he would be one of the few child stars who would make it. But childhood fame has a sharp edge, and Adam bled slowly from it. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the spotlight had moved on. He took fewer roles, and the ones he did take never brought the same light. Behind closed doors, addiction crept in. Arrests followed. Rehab came and went. Adam was fighting battles he never signed up for, shaped by an industry that never taught him how to live without applause. And when he finally stepped back from public life, it was not for a new career or a quiet retirement. It was because he had nothing left to give the screen. When Adam passed away in 2023, it was one of those headlines that made people pause. Wait, Adam Rich? He was still around? Yes, he was. He just was not on our screens anymore. He disappeared without saying goodbye. And maybe the hardest part is realizing that no one asked where he went until he was gone for good. The name Tatum O'Neal still holds a kind of magic. She was not just a child star, she was a child legend, the youngest person in history to ever win an Academy Award. Think about that. 10 years old. Most kids are still figuring out long division, and she was accepting an Oscar for Paper Moon. But here is the twist. The same moment that crowned her also began to erase her. Tatum became a household name overnight. But behind that poised little girl on stage was a storm that would follow her into adulthood. Her family life was rocky at best. Growing up under the shadow of her famous father, Ryan O'Neal, meant constant tension, public feuds, and a pressure to perform not just on camera, but in life. She did a few more roles in the 1970s and early 1980s, but by the time she was old enough to vote, Hollywood had already started closing the door, and she did not slam it shut. It just quietly clicked behind her. Drugs, arrests, rehab. The usual script for a fallen star, but with Tatum, it hurt more. Because we knew her. She was brilliant. She was first. She was the girl who could outact the adults around her. And then she disappeared into tabloid blurbs and whispered updates. Not gone. Just missing. Like someone who left a note that got lost in the laundry. Even today, people ask whatever happened to her like they are searching for a lost childhood friend. She has made appearances here and there, reality shows, memoirs, some acting returns, but it has never been the same. She never got the triumphant second act. And maybe that is the hardest part of all. She gave us everything so early and then vanished before we could say thank you. Or goodbye. There was something different about Lance Kerwin. He was not flashy or overly polished. He felt real, like the boy from the neighborhood who read too many books and noticed everything. As James and James at 15, Lance carried a quiet kind of wisdom that made the show feel more like real life than television. He was not playing a character. He was James, the kind of teen idol who did not have to try too hard. He just was. But then, without any big send-off or dramatic farewell, Lance Kerwin disappeared from our screens, and almost no one asked why. The show itself was groundbreaking. It tackled real issues, awkwardness, faith, loneliness, love, in ways most television back then would not touch. And Lance was the anchor that made it believable. For a brief moment in the 1970s, he was the boy every teenager could see themselves in. But the moment passed. His star faded. Hollywood moved on to louder, shinier things. And Lance? He quietly stepped away, almost as if he knew the business was not built for someone like him. In the decades that followed, his name would pop up now and then. Maybe someone remembered Salem's Lot or saw an old clip online. But for the most part, he lived outside the spotlight, working regular jobs, raising a family, staying away from headlines. His life after fame was not filled with scandal or reality television comebacks. It was quieter, maybe harder, definitely lonelier. When Lance passed away in early 2023, it caught people off guard. Not because he was famous again, but because his absence had been so complete that his name had almost slipped through the cracks of memory. He was one of the rare stars who did disappear without saying goodbye. And maybe that is the bittersweet part. He did not need the last word, but a lot of us still wish we had the chance to say ours. You did not just watch Johnny Whitaker, you rooted for him. He had that open-hearted charm that made every kid wish he was their best friend. Whether he was playing Jody on Family Affair or swinging from trees in Tom Sawyer, Johnny had a way of filling a screen with something warm and honest. And for a while, it felt like he would always be around. But just like that, he vanished. Not in the scandalous, headlines-grabbing kind of way, but in the quiet way that makes you wonder if anyone noticed at all. Back in the 1970s, Johnny Whitaker was everywhere. His red hair and wide grin were part of the American television landscape. He was not just cast in roles. He was the role. He brought a kind of innocence to every character that felt real, even in the most scripted moments. And then, it stopped. Audiences got older, networks changed, and the industry did what it always does. It let go of the kids it once praised. Johnny struggled with that shift. Like many former child stars, he battled addiction, lost direction, and had to rebuild a life without the applause. But he never became a tabloid fixture. Instead, he tried to help others, working with recovery programs, staying involved in support groups, and quietly trying to turn things around. Still, his career never returned. Hollywood had moved on, and Johnny, it seemed, had moved on too. There is something especially haunting about his story, not because it ended in tragedy, but because it faded so gently. No crash, no comeback. Just a boy we once knew, whose smile lit up the screen, stepping out of the frame. And for those who grew up with him, it leaves a strange kind of ache. Like turning on an old show and realizing the kid you remember is gone and you never got the chance to say goodbye. Dana Plato's story does not just tug at your heart, it tears it open. She was the face of Different Strokes, the tough yet tender Kimberly who brought a dose of realness to a show already rich in heart. She was not just part of a cast, she was part of a generation's upbringing. And then she was gone. Not overnight, but over time. And every step of the way was a little more painful to watch. Fame came fast and early for Dana, but the industry that put her on a pedestal gave her no tools to survive once the pedestal was gone. After Different Strokes ended, the offers dried up, roles disappeared. She tried a few things, small films, a reality show appearance, even a brief attempt at music, but none of it stuck. She was not the bright-eyed Kimberly anymore, and Hollywood was not in the business of helping fallen stars find their way back. What came next was a spiral: legal trouble, substance abuse, public embarrassment. Dana's name was no longer tied to her talent, but to her struggle. People whispered about her in tabloids, but no one really reached out. She was becoming a cautionary tale before she had the chance to rewrite her story. Her final years were marked by hardship and isolation, and even when she tried to reclaim her narrative, no one seemed ready to listen. Dana passed away in 1999. She was only 34 years old. Her death was ruled a suicide. But even more tragic was how little noise the world made when she left it. No retrospectives, no major tributes, just a quiet exit for someone who once meant so much to so many. She disappeared without saying goodbye, but maybe the real tragedy is that we let her. For a lot of people, the face of childhood was Cindy Brady. The blonde curls, the lisp, the pigtails, Susan Olsen turned what could have been a one-note character into a pop culture icon. She was the youngest Brady, but somehow always the one with the most heart. And for a few years, every living room in America knew her smile. But what happens when you grow out of the pigtails? What happens when the world only wants you to stay small, sweet, and frozen in time? The Brady Bunch was everywhere in the early 1970s. It was not just a show, it was a cultural comfort blanket. And Susan Olsen was a huge part of that. Kids saw themselves in her, parents saw their children in her. But when the show ended, Susan, like many of her co-stars, found herself trapped by the image that had made her famous. She was not Cindy Brady anymore, but nobody wanted anyone else. She took some time away from acting, tried other creative paths, graphic design, radio hosting, even political commentary. But none of it ever put her back in the spotlight the way the Brady Bunch had. And that spotlight, once so warm, became a shadow she could never fully step out of. For a while, she stayed off the radar almost entirely. No major roles, no big interviews, just silence. When she did return, it was mostly in Brady reunions or niche projects. There was no dramatic fall, no scandal, just a steady drift away from the center of attention. And maybe that is why her story feels so strange. Because in a way, she is still here, but not the way we remember. The Cindy we knew disappeared long ago, and Susan never really got to say goodbye. Bobby Brady was the youngest brother, the curious one, the kid with the mischief in his eyes. And for a lot of families in the 1970s, Mike Lookinland was Bobby. He brought something real to the screen. A little awkward, a little wild, and completely lovable. But like so many others from the Brady Bunch, Mike found himself stuck in a role that never aged with him. Once the show ended, so did the version of him that most of America remembered. There is something bittersweet about being everyone's little brother, and then suddenly not being seen at all. Audiences remember the smile, the one-liners, the striped shirts, but they rarely stop to ask what came after. For Mike, life after Bobby was not a crash. It was more like slowly disappearing behind a closed door. The world kept watching reruns, but Mike had already stepped away. He tried to keep working in entertainment, but it was never the same. His look changed, his voice changed, and the roles stopped coming. That is how it goes with child stars. Hollywood knows how to cast them, but not how to keep them. Mike quietly slipped behind the camera, taking on work in production and cinematography, jobs that did not ask him to smile or say a catchphrase. He had to rebuild his identity from scratch. But it was not easy. Fame leaves a mark. And when your whole childhood is on tape, it is hard to grow up without everyone watching. Mike battled alcohol addiction in his adult years, facing down the silence that comes when fame fades, but the pressure stays. He eventually got clean, moved to Utah, and focused on family life. But you could always tell there was a part of him still connected to that little boy in the striped shirt. He popped up now and then for Brady reunions, always with that same gentle demeanor, always polite. But you could see it in his eyes. He was someone who had moved on long ago, someone who had disappeared on purpose. And maybe that is the quiet strength of his story. He did not fall apart. He just walked away without saying goodbye. You might not remember his name, but you definitely remember his face. Mason Reese was everywhere in the 1970s. That unmistakable voice, that red hair, those quirky expressions. He was not just a child actor. He was a phenomenon. Not from sitcoms or movies, but from television commercials. He sold peanut butter, fast food, breakfast cereal, you name it. He was a commercial darling, and for a short while, he had the country wrapped around his little finger. He was not the kind of famous that came from scripts. He was the kind of famous that lived between Saturday morning cartoons. There was something magnetic about him, like he knew how to grab your attention without even trying. In just seconds, he made you laugh or smile or want whatever he was selling. And then just like that, the commercials stopped, and so did the attention. Unlike most child stars, Mason did not come from a hit show or a beloved series. He came from 30-second spots that aired in millions of homes every day. And somehow, that made him even more familiar. You did not watch Mason once a week. You saw him every time you turned on the television. He had that rare charisma that made advertisers compete for his time. But then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. As he grew older, the roles dried up. The charm that worked at 6 years old did not work at 16. And Mason, like so many others, had to face a world that no longer knew what to do with him. He left the screen and stepped into business, opening restaurants in New York and dabbling in media work behind the scenes. He stayed active, but quietly. No more cereal spots, no more endorsements, just a different kind of life. People would ask, "Hey, whatever happened to that peanut butter kid?" And there would be no easy answer, because Mason Reese did not crash. He just faded. Fame is loud, but obscurity is quieter than we ever expect. His story is not one of tragedy or scandal, but it is one of vanishing. He did not leave with a curtain call. He just stopped being seen. And when you think about how much joy he brought into living rooms across the country, it feels like someone we all should have thanked. Before she was known for reality television and tabloids, Kim Richards was the face of Disney magic in the 1970s. She was in everything: Escape to Witch Mountain, Return from Witch Mountain, and a string of made-for-TV movies where she always played the clever, kind-hearted girl you could not help but root for. There was something effortlessly bright about her. She looked like childhood. She felt like a memory you wanted to keep. But the strange thing about being Disney's go-to child star is that they never seem to know what to do with you once you grow up. Kim was the kind of actress who made even the most far-fetched storylines feel grounded. She had a way of looking at the camera that made you believe what she was feeling, even when it was make-believe. Kids wanted to be her, parents trusted her, and Disney built whole movies around that kind of trust. But when the magic faded, they did not give her a map for what came next. Kim started acting when she was barely out of diapers. By the time she was 10, she had more credits than some adults in the business. But that much fame that early does something to you. It distorts your sense of time. One moment you are running from aliens on a movie set, and the next, no one is calling anymore. Disney moved on. Audiences moved on. And Kim, still barely a teenager, was left to figure out who she was without a script to follow. She did a few things after her Disney years, a couple of teen dramas, guest spots on shows, but the glow had dimmed. The industry that had once embraced her had gone cold. she stepped away. Quietly. For years, Kim lived almost entirely out of the spotlight. No press tours, no big scandals, just silence. And it was only in the early 2000s, when reality television came calling, that we really saw her again. But even then, she was not the Disney star we remembered. She was someone older, carrying the weight of things unspoken, family issues, personal battles, a complicated past. She had not just disappeared, she had survived. And when you look back at those early films and see that little girl light up the screen, it is hard not to feel a little sadness, because you realize she was never given the chance to say goodbye. She just vanished right after giving the world all that joy. In the 1970s, Robby Benson was not just a teen idol, he was the teen idol. The soft voice, the soulful eyes, the vulnerability that came through in every line, he made you believe. Whether he was in Ice Castles, Ode to Billy Joe, or The Chosen, Robby carried a kind of emotional weight that few young actors ever had. He was not flashy or over the top, he just felt. And for a while, that made him one of the most sought-after young actors in the country. But then he did something almost no one in his position would do. He walked away. Girls taped his posters to bedroom walls, and critics called him the next Paul Newman. He played characters who cried, who hurt, who made you feel like they were living the moment right alongside you. In an era of cool guys and comic relief, Robby made sensitivity something to look up to. That is part of why his sudden silence felt like losing someone personal. By the early 1980s, Robby had stepped behind the camera. He directed, he wrote, he voiced the Beast in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, yes, that Beast. But his face all but disappeared from the screen. No more magazine covers, no more heartthrob posters on bedroom walls. He had vanished, but on his own terms. Part of it had to do with health. Robby had struggled for years with a congenital heart condition that led to multiple surgeries. Acting was no longer the top priority, living was. He talked openly about it later, but at the time, no one really knew why he was gone. He had not flamed out, he had not stumbled, he had just gone quiet. In many ways, his story is the rare example of someone choosing peace over fame. But even that peace came at a price. Fans were left wondering. One day, you are watching him cry on screen and believing every second, and the next, he is just gone. Not forgotten, but definitely missing. Robby Benson disappeared from public view not in shame, not in failure, but in silence. And for a generation that grew up loving him, that silence still lingers. There is something about Brandon Cruz that always stuck with people. Maybe it was the scruffy hair or the way he always spoke like he was thinking 3 thoughts ahead. As Eddie on The Courtship of Eddie's Father, he brought a unique kind of honesty to the screen. He was not the polished, well-behaved TV kid. He was curious, opinionated, real. And that made him unforgettable. For a few years, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Brandon Cruz was a household name. And then, he was not. He had that rare quality, natural charm without a trace of calculation. His chemistry with Bill Bixby gave the show its heart, and their scenes together felt like real-life father and son moments. There was a gentleness in his presence, a thoughtful kind of mischief that made him feel like a real kid, not a product. Which is why, when he stepped away from acting, it felt like someone closed a book mid-chapter. The show ended, as shows do. But Brandon did not stick around in the way so many others tried to. He took a different path entirely. Music, activism, punk rock of all things. He fronted a band called Doctor. No, became involved in the punk scene and made it clear that he was not chasing his past. He was building something new. But that meant leaving the Hollywood version of himself behind. And for most of America, that looked like disappearing. He was not in the tabloids, not on reunion specials, not even on the nostalgia circuit. He just lived his life, on his terms, outside the bubble of fame. There is a kind of strength in that. But it also meant that the boy who once sat at the heart of one of television's most heartfelt shows slowly became a question mark. People would say, "Whatever happened to Eddie?" and never quite get a full answer. Because Brandon Cruz is one of those rare child stars who did not fall from grace. He walked away from it. Still, for those who grew up watching him joke around with Bill Bixby on primetime television, it is hard not to feel the absence. The Eddie we knew never got a send-off. He just stopped appearing. And in that silence, something about childhood slipped away too. There was a time when Melissa Sue Anderson was in almost every home in America. Not in person, of course, but through that quiet, gentle face on the television, week after week. She played Mary Ingalls on Little House on the Prairie, the eldest daughter in a family struggling through frontier life. And even if the setting was old-fashioned, the emotions were timeless. She was serious, strong, kind, and she was a constant. You could always count on Mary Ingalls to do the right thing. But once the show ended, something happened. Melissa Sue Anderson disappeared. Not in some dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in the kind of way that only gets noticed much later. When someone asks, "Hey, whatever happened to her?" Her performance on Little House was more than just a part. It was a defining role in television history. Melissa carried some of the most emotional storylines on the show: blindness, loss, courage. She gave Mary a real inner life, something rare for child actors. She was nominated for awards, praised by critics, loved by families. And then, as the years went on, the character of Mary started appearing less and less. By the final seasons, she was barely there. In real life, Melissa was doing what many young actors tried but few succeeded at: growing up. And with that came distance. Distance from the character. Distance from the public. She took on a few roles after Little House, including a horror movie or two, some television movies, but nothing ever stuck the way Mary Ingalls had. Whether by choice or circumstance, she slowly stepped away from Hollywood. And unlike others, she did it with almost no noise, no tabloids, no big farewell tour, just silence. She moved to Canada, focused on her family, lived a private life. She even became a citizen there. For someone who once lived inside a character seen by millions, she became someone you rarely saw at all. When she published a memoir in 2010, it gave a few more clues, a quiet explanation of why she kept her distance from the public eye. She was proud of her work, but not interested in living in the past. And maybe that is what makes her story so powerful. She chose a life outside the spotlight. She did not need to be remembered every day to know who she was. Still, for those who grew up with Little House on the Prairie, the absence is felt. You turn on an old rerun, and there she is, clear-eyed and thoughtful, and you cannot help but wonder why she slipped away without a goodbye. Quinn Cummings never acted like your typical child star. That was part of her appeal. She was sharp, funny, a little awkward in the most relatable way, and when she appeared in The Goodbye Girl, she turned what could have been a side character into the emotional core of the movie. She was just 10 years old when she got nominated for an Academy Award, and for a while it looked like she was going to be one of the few child actors who could make it all the way. But then before most people even learned her name properly, she was gone. It is strange to say someone faded when they were still winning awards and landing roles, but that is kind of what happened. Quinn went on to star in the sitcom Family for a few seasons, picking up an Emmy nomination along the way. She did a handful of projects after that, but not many. There was no scandal, no public meltdown. She just stepped off the stage. Part of it, she would later say, was choice. Hollywood was not something she wanted to stay in. She was curious about the world beyond casting calls and makeup chairs. But still, to audiences who had come to love her quick wit and endearing screen presence, her absence felt jarring. There was no warning, no last big role, no moment of closure, just a slow retreat, like a light dimming in the corner of the room. What Quinn did next was even more surprising. She became a writer, a humorist, and an entrepreneur. She created a baby carrier product, published essays and books, and became a sharp voice on social media. Her wit had only gotten sharper, but unless you were following closely, you might never have known she was still out there. And that is the thing about vanishing. It does not always mean you are lost. Sometimes it just means you changed lanes without telling anyone. Her story is not one of heartbreak or failure. It is one of evolution. But for fans who still watch The Goodbye Girl and laugh at her punchy lines, her early exit from acting feels incomplete. There was never a goodbye, never a send-off. She left when she was still rising. And in that silence, something special slipped away. Not lost, just missing. Pamelyn Ferdin had the kind of resume most adult actors would envy, and she had it before she could drive a car. She was everywhere in the 1960s and 70s. If you watched cartoons, you knew her as the voice of Lucy from Peanuts. If you watched television, she guest starred on just about every show that mattered. The Brady Bunch, Star Trek, Gunsmoke, Lassie, The Odd Couple. And in every role, there was something strong, distinct, and smart about her. She had range, she had confidence, and she had that rare ability to feel familiar the moment she walked on screen. But for some reason, we stopped seeing her. And few people ever asked why. As a child actress, Pamelyn was everywhere, playing tomboys, sidekicks, daughters, victims, and sometimes even villains. She could voice a cartoon and then pivot to a serious drama in the same year. Hollywood seemed to have plans for her. Big ones. But as the 1970s moved into the 1980s, her screen appearances started to slow, and soon enough, they stopped. What happened is not dramatic. It is just quietly painful. Pamelyn tried to keep working, but the roles did not come. She was typecast. Audiences remembered her as a kid, and casting directors struggled to see her as anything else. So she made a decision that few young actors have the courage to make. She walked away. Not angrily, not loudly, just walked. She did something very few from her world ever do. She chose a life of activism. She became a registered nurse, got involved in animal rights advocacy, and dedicated decades of her life to causes most people ignore. Her face left television, but her energy was poured into protests, campaigns, and compassion. She even ran for public office. And all the while, her acting career remained a distant echo, something she never denied, but never chased again. Pamelyn has spoken out here and there, on podcasts, in interviews, about the dark side of being a child star, the pressure, the loneliness, the industry's tendency to forget you the moment you stop being marketable. And hearing her reflect now, it is clear she never really disappeared. She simply transformed into someone the industry no longer recognized. Still, for viewers who grew up hearing Lucy yell at Charlie Brown or watching Pamelyn light up their black and white sets, her vanishing act feels unfinished. She gave us so much and never asked for anything back. She left, not because she failed, but because she had bigger things to do. But she did it without a curtain call. And sometimes, that is the hardest kind of goodbye. Roundhouse was what happened when raw teen energy smashed into a live stage and exploded into music, movement, and unapologetic weirdness. It was not just a sketch show. It was a stage, a rotating one literally, where comedy met chaos and somehow made sense of being a teenager in the 1990s. Roundhouse was messy, loud, and never afraid to take swings at real issues. Divorce, bullying, crushes, loneliness, it tackled all of it. But not with lectures or moral of the day endings. It used dance, it used music, it used fast cuts and louder voices than any adult was ready for. Every episode felt like a fever dream on roller skates, but it worked because it came from truth. This was a show made by young people, for young people, without a single ounce of condescension. The cast felt like your friends, the cooler, weirder ones who actually talked about stuff no one else would. One moment, you would be laughing at a sketch about school lunch. The next, you were suddenly thinking about what it meant to grow up in a broken home. And then, just like that, you were dancing again. Roundhouse made you feel seen, not polished, not perfect, just seen. It was the voice in your head screaming, "Why does no one talk about this?" And then suddenly, they did. It burned bright, burned fast, and left behind a legacy that still feels impossible to replicate. It was not just a kids' show. It was a stage for everything real, messy, and beautiful about growing up. Taran Noah Smith was the youngest son in Home Improvement, the awkward, often forgotten middle child of the Taylor family. He grew up on screen, his voice deepening as the seasons passed, his expressions maturing as America watched from their living rooms. But behind the jokes and tool puns was a boy who never asked for any of it. Fame was something that happened to him, never something he chased. When the show ended, Taran was just 17 years old. He did not celebrate his Hollywood success. He walked away from it, completely. He distanced himself from the industry, from the money, from the spotlight. Instead, he turned towards something far more grounded: veganism, sustainable living, building homes with alternative materials, and running a food company that served organic meals to schools. While others searched for ways back into television, Taran planted his feet firmly in the soil, literally. His story is not flashy, it is not headline-grabbing, but it is powerful. He has spoken about how alienating childhood fame can be, how it distorts your sense of self, your future, your place in the world. Taran did not want to be remembered for punchlines or reruns. He wanted to build something real. And while the world may have forgotten his name, it is clear he never forgot who he was. There is something beautiful about a child star who grows up and becomes exactly who they needed when they were young. Taran Noah Smith disappeared from our screens, but maybe that is because he found a better way to show up in the world. What happened to Miranda? That was the question every kid had when the final season of Lizzie McGuire aired, and Lain was nowhere to be seen. You are watching a Disney Channel classic, you are watching Lizzie McGuire, and suddenly one of the trio is just gone. There was no big send-off, no farewell episode, not even a passing mention. Fans who grew up watching Lizzie, Gordo, and Miranda as the inseparable crew were just left to wonder. Lain was not just any character either. She was one of the few cool girls on television who felt real. She wore baggy pants, played guitar, and always said what was on her mind. Basically, she was the teen best friend everyone wished they had. But then she vanished, without saying goodbye. The official reason for her absence from the Lizzie McGuire movie and later episodes was a scheduling conflict. But let's be honest, nobody believed that. Years later, Lain herself would hint at deeper issues. The pressure of the spotlight, stereotypes, and being one of the very few Filipino-American actresses in a leading Disney role were all real. There were no interviews, no press releases, just a sudden absence that was never explained. For kids watching at home, it was like losing a best friend and never hearing from them again. That kind of quiet disappearance hits harder than most people realize. She did not just leave Lizzie McGuire, she stepped away from the industry entirely. During that time, she explored music, wrote songs, and kept a low profile. A few minor roles popped up here and there, but it never felt like a comeback. Interviews were rare, social media posts were sporadic, fans kept hoping for a reunion or even just a response to what happened, but nothing came. It was as if the same Miranda who walked out of our favorite middle school hallways had never existed in the first place. Now, when people rewatch the show, there is a strange emptiness. Lizzie and Gordo keep going, but the spark that Miranda added is just missing. Maybe that is why her disappearance hit so hard. Because it was not just about a character. It was about someone who meant something to millions of kids, vanishing at the height of her story arc. We never got closure, and that silence, even now, still echoes. Salute Your Shorts was summer chaos in a canteen, and it never pretended to be anything else. It was loud, it was messy, it was full of farts, fights, pranks, and perfectly awkward teenage energy. Camp Anawanna was not a place where you became a better person. It was where you survived the weirdest summer of your life, and maybe came out a little stronger for it. This show was Nickelodeon in its rawest form. Zero polish, all heart. Every episode felt like it had been made in the dirt, in the heat, under the screech of a bug zapper, and that was the point. The kids were not actors. They were walking disasters with just enough charm to keep you watching. You had the bully, the nerd, the weirdo, the jock, but it never felt fake. They were too wild to be scripted, too alive to be boring. You watched because it felt real. Not real like documentary, real like, I remember what it was like to be 13 and not know what the hell was going on. There were food fights, broken bunk beds, stolen underwear on flagpoles, and in the middle of all that, tiny moments of heart. Someone standing up for the little guy. Someone realizing they actually missed home. Someone writing a dumb song that accidentally made everyone cry. Salute Your Shorts was a love letter to the summer you swore you hated but secretly treasure to this day. It was uncomfortable. It was inappropriate. It was exactly what being a kid felt like. Lisa Jakub was the girl you could believe in. The rebellious daughter in Mrs. Doubtfire, the panicked teen in Independence Day. She had a rare kind of authenticity that made every character feel personal. She was never the loudest in the room. She was the realest. But sometimes the realest ones are the first to realize that something is wrong. Lisa's exit from Hollywood was not a scandal. It was a quiet refusal, a soft rebellion, a truth spoken out loud. By age 14, she was told she could not return to her school because filming conflicted with attendance. Robin Williams even wrote a letter to try to help her stay. But the message was clear. Being an actor meant choosing performance over personhood. Lisa never forgot that. The dissonance between who she was and who she was paid to be grew louder with every role. Eventually, she chose to leave. She moved away from the industry toward a life that made more sense. Writing, advocating, healing. Like Mara Wilson, Lisa began to speak openly about anxiety, trauma, and the quiet devastation of child fame. Her memoir, You Look Like That Girl, does not glamorize the past. It reclaims it. It turns a fading spotlight into a candle. Gentle, true, and still burning. We remember her face from film, but it is her voice in print that lingers longer now. And maybe that is the story beneath the story, that sometimes disappearing is not vanishing. It is transforming. It is taking your own name back. Taran Noah Smith was the youngest of the Taylor boys on Home Improvement. He was the wide-eyed, goofy one, always asking weird questions, always getting in trouble, but in the best possible way. He was not just a background character. He had a presence, a kind of innocent honesty that made him feel like everyone's little brother. But once the series wrapped, Taran vanished. Not a pause, not a break, a full stop. What made his disappearance stand out was how intentional it seemed. He was just 16 when Home Improvement ended, and he made it very clear. He was done. He wanted nothing to do with Hollywood. No spin-offs, no sequels. He did not even want to act again. Instead, Taran went in a completely different direction. He started a vegan food business, bought a house, tried to live quietly. But the press kept coming. People were obsessed with his choices. He had gotten married to someone 16 years older than him. He was investing in offbeat business ideas. And all the while, he was still just a teenager trying to figure it all out. There were legal battles with his parents over money he earned as a child actor. There were stories about him rejecting the Hollywood lifestyle. But Taran kept doing things his way, even when it did not make sense to the people watching from the outside. Today, he lives almost entirely off the grid. Occasionally, he pops up in an interview or news piece. But he is not chasing the spotlight. He is not nostalgic about the show. He does not miss the fame. And maybe that is what makes his story so rare. He walked away before the machine could chew him up. Before the headlines, before the downfall, he disappeared while things were still good, on his terms. When you rewatch Home Improvement, it is hard not to smile when you see him. That kid, so full of life and timing. And then you wonder what it must feel like to have had that much attention, and to choose a life where no one knows your name. The Adventures of Pete and Pete was not a show, it was a feeling. The kind that snuck into your heart through the weird back door of childhood and never really left. Two brothers, same name. A small town full of the strangest people you could imagine. But it never felt like a joke. It felt like truth. wrapped in surreal humor and drenched in quiet sadness. Pete and Pete was about childhood, but not in the usual shiny, safe way. It was about how weird and painful and magical it can all be. How a metal plate in your head might pick up radio signals, how your mom might wrestle a bowling trophy, how your best friend might just be the strongest man in the world, and no one would question it. The show never explained itself, because life does not explain itself, it just happens. Pete and Pete let you sit in that weirdness. It let you feel confused and still completely seen. The music was dreamy, the visuals were raw, and the voiceover from Big Pete had the kind of melancholy wisdom that only makes sense after you grow up. This show made you nostalgic while you were still living the moment. And now, years later, it feels like opening a box of memories you forgot you buried. Jane Withers had a smile that could knock you sideways. In the 1930s, she was one of the most bankable child stars in Hollywood. Funny, spirited, and unmistakably bold. She lit up the screen in a way few kids ever could, and for a while, she seemed unstoppable. But by the time she was in her teens, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She retired. Jane stepped away from the spotlight while she was still beloved, while she could still call the shots, and for decades it seemed like she had vanished. But Jane never truly left the industry. She just shifted. She returned years later, not as a starlet, but as a character actor and voice performer. She reinvented herself quietly, steadily, and with an incredible sense of grace. Most of her later fans knew her not as the little firecracker from the 1930s, but as Josephine the plumber from television commercials in the 1960s. That is how versatile she was, able to charm audiences across generations without clinging to old glories. She was not trying to be a child star forever. She was just trying to be Jane. Her journey is not one of heartbreak, but evolution. Jane Withers reminds us that disappearing is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is an act of wisdom, of timing, of knowing when to step back and when to reappear with something new to offer. For a while, Andrew Lawrence was just about everywhere. If you had a television in the late 1990s, there was no avoiding him. He starred alongside his real-life brothers, Joey and Matthew, in Brotherly Love, a show that somehow made sibling chaos feel charming. Andrew was the youngest, but often the funniest. He had the floppy hair, the sharp timing, and that kind of effortless presence you just could not teach. And then one day, it was over. He faded out of teen television without headlines, without drama, without a word. What made his story feel so strange was that he was part of a family built for the spotlight. The Lawrence brothers were a package deal. From Boy Meets World to Disney Channel movies, they were Hollywood's golden boys for a minute. And Andrew? He had serious momentum, guest spots, voice work, leading roles in teen films. You would think the next step was obvious. But instead of blowing up, he backed away. He still worked here and there, some voice roles, some indie stuff, but it was never in the public eye the way it had been. There were no red carpets, no major campaigns. The name Andrew Lawrence slowly stopped popping up in credits, and yet there was never a scandal. Never a big moment of fallout. He just moved on, started working behind the camera, focused on music, stayed close to his brothers, but kept a smaller circle. For fans who remembered him as a mainstay of the late 90s Disney lineup, the silence was jarring. You would scroll through reruns and wonder, wait, what happened to him? And there was no real answer. That is the thing about fame when you are young. Sometimes it does not come crashing down, it just slips quietly out the door. And with Andrew Lawrence, it felt like one moment he was everywhere, and the next, he was someone you only remembered in flashes. No goodbye, no finale, just gone. Tailspin was the kind of show that dropped you in the middle of the sky with no map, no instructions, and no idea why Baloo from the Jungle Book was suddenly flying a cargo plane. But none of that mattered. Because the moment the theme song kicked in, you were gone. Up, and away into a world of sea ducks, sky pirates, and wild adventures. Tailspin reimagined a familiar character and placed him in a setting that was pure fantasy mixed with just enough grit. Cape Suzette was a port city unlike anything on television. Part Casablanca, part Saturday morning cartoon fever dream. Baloo was the same old lovable bear, but now he was a lazy but talented pilot dodging air raids and trying to make rent. And then there was Rebecca Cunningham, who owned the business and always had to remind Baloo that charisma does not pay the bills. Tailspin had comedy, danger, high-speed chases, and just the right amount of heart. But underneath all the fun was something more, a quiet message about responsibility, friendship, and second chances. Baloo was not a hero. He was flawed, tired, and always chasing one more shortcut. But he had heart and loyalty, and that made all the difference. You stayed for the air battles and plane crashes, but you came back for the moments where someone made the hard choice, the right choice, even if it cost them. Tailspin was more than a cartoon. It was a high-flying lesson in doing your best, even when your best feels like it is not enough. Jimmy McNichol was not just a teen idol. He was the teen idol of the late 1970s. He had the hair, the smile, the voice, and the kind of effortless charisma that made girls scream and casting directors scramble. He starred in films, television, and even had a short-lived music career with his sister Christy. But just when it seemed like he was destined to become a permanent fixture in pop culture, Jimmy did something nobody expected. He walked away. By the early 1990s, Jimmy had stepped back from acting completely. Not because the roles stopped coming, not because of scandal, but because he wanted something deeper than fame could offer. He turned to environmental advocacy and real estate, dedicating his life to causes that had nothing to do with cameras or red carpets. It was not a retreat, it was a rebirth. You have to understand what that means. To walk away at the height of popularity, to say no to the world's applause and yes to your own quiet purpose. Jimmy could have tried to stay in the spotlight forever. He could have milked his fame into middle age. Instead, he chose a life rooted in service, sustainability, and simplicity. Today, he lives peacefully, far from the noise of the industry that once adored him. He still speaks occasionally about his past, but never with bitterness, just gratitude. And maybe that is the lesson here, that some disappearances are not a fall. They are a return to solid ground. Ashley Aston Moore was unforgettable, but the world somehow forgot her anyway. You may remember her best as young Chrissy in Now and Then, a film that became something sacred for a whole generation of girls. That movie was everything. Summer nostalgia, growing pains, friendship, and feeling understood for the first time. Ashley stood out even in a cast full of future A-listers. Her comic timing was natural, her expressions effortless. She made awkwardness feel sweet and made every scene she was in feel warmer, but not long after the film's release, she simply disappeared. There were no major scandals, no splashy headlines, just silence. She did a few guest roles, a television movie here and there, and then gone. While her co-stars rose through the ranks of Hollywood, Ashley's name slipped out of the credits and out of memory, except for those who remembered and missed her. The truth came years later, in the worst possible way. In 2007, Ashley Aston Moore passed away at only 26 years old. The cause was an accidental drug overdose. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The disappearance, the distance, the silence. Behind it all was a young woman who had struggled deeply after childhood fame faded. There is something especially haunting about child stars who leave no final message. It is not just about career. It is about how easily people can slip through the cracks when the cameras stop rolling. Ashley never got a second act. She never got to grow into a new version of herself on screen. And yet her performance in Now and Then still lives in people's hearts. Sometimes when you rewatch that film and you see her smile or crack a joke, there is a strange ache you feel in your chest, like you are watching someone frozen in time, someone who made an impact and then vanished. No goodbye, no send-off. just a quiet exit from a loud world. Gullah Island was not just a kids' show. It was a window into joy that was loud, colorful, and full of music you still remember the words to, even now. Before you understood what culture meant, this show showed you. It showed you what community felt like, what love looked like when it danced and sang and wore bright colors without ever apologizing. Gullah Island was built around a real culture, Gullah, the descendants of West African people brought to the coastal South. That culture was always there. It was in the way the characters spoke, in the rhythm of the songs, in the way the family cared for each other. But you did not need a history book to understand it. You felt it. You saw it in how the characters laughed, helped, taught, and celebrated together. There was a frog named Binya, who might have been the most joyful puppet to ever hop across your screen. There were sing-alongs you can probably hum right now without even trying. And there was always a lesson, but it never felt like a lecture. It felt like play, like freedom, like someone gave your imagination a place to run barefoot outside. Looking back, it is wild that a show this beautiful, this rooted in real culture, ever faded from memory. It should be studied. It should be celebrated. But instead, it sits buried in the back corners of streaming nostalgia. Gullah Island taught you what it meant to live in harmony, with people, with family, with the land, and with your own voice. And now that you are older, you realize how rare that is, how precious, how needed. How many kids shows today even try to do that? Jeff Cohen gave us one of the most unforgettable performances in 80s cinema, and he did it with a belly, a scream, and a dance. As Chunk in the Goonies, he was the heart of a generation's favorite misfit crew. He was not cool, not slick, not heroic in the classic sense, but he was real, and that made him unforgettable. The Truffle Shuffle became legend, and so did Jeff. But then, nothing. After the Goonies, Jeff Cohen quietly left the screen behind. No chase for bigger roles, no desperate clinging to fame. Instead, he did something few expected. He reinvented himself. While Hollywood was busy trying to fit him into boxes he had already outgrown, Jeff walked away and studied law. He became an entertainment lawyer, not a punchline, not a sidekick, a force. Today, he is behind the scenes, navigating contracts instead of scripts, protecting artists instead of performing as one. And the irony is beautiful. The kid who once had to shout to be heard now helps others speak for themselves. He is powerful, respected, and deeply grounded in the very industry that once tried to define him. His story is not just about transformation. It is about reclaiming identity, about proving that child actors are not frozen in time. They grow, they evolve, and sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is trade the spotlight for something quieter, but just as impactful. Jeff Cohen did not just disappear. He became something more. Misha Barton's face was once impossible to miss. The OC turned her into a household name almost overnight. As Marissa Cooper, she was the show's emotional core, a mess of contradictions, heartache, beauty, and self-destruction. And that role made her famous. Overnight, she was everywhere. Magazine covers, paparazzi shots, red carpets. But when her character was killed off in season 3, something shifted, and fast. Her departure from the show was dramatic, both on-screen and behind the scenes. Marissa's death was shocking, but what followed was even more so. Misha did not pivot to blockbuster films or major TV dramas. Instead, she kind of just disappeared from A-list attention. There were rumors, creative differences, burnout, even whispers of behind-the-scenes drama. Whatever the reason, she vanished from the kind of spotlight she once owned, and in its place, a lot of tabloid noise. Misha became more known for what happened after fame than during it. She was photographed more for what she wore at gas stations than any new role. She tried a few comebacks, reality TV, indie films, smaller parts, but nothing ever stuck the way the OC had. It is easy to forget just how young she was when everything hit. Misha was barely out of her teens, and she was dealing with fame levels that would have broken anyone. Now, when people look back on the OC, Her absence is what stands out most. Everyone else got some version of a second act. But Misha? She left the main stage and never really came back. There is something especially haunting about that, because for so many fans, she was the show. And when she vanished, it felt like the whole world of the OC cracked. Sometimes disappearing is not about failure, it is about escape. And maybe Misha Barton knew she had to step away before the industry consumed her entirely. Michael Oliver was the kind of kid who could turn chaos into comedy. As Junior in Problem Child, he was everything the title promised: wild, loud, hilarious, and just a little dangerous. He was not your typical sweet-faced Hollywood kid. He was a troublemaker you could not help but love. And then, like the perfect punchline to a joke we did not see coming, he was gone. His exit was sudden, but the signs were always there. The Problem Child films made money, but they also made problems: legal disputes, managerial chaos, allegations of financial exploitation. Behind the scenes, Michael's world was unraveling before it even had a chance to begin. By the time he was a teenager, the industry had already burned him out. He did not just step away, he stepped back into anonymity. And he has rarely looked back. Today, Michael lives far from Hollywood's orbit. He is not trying to reclaim fame. He is not on reality shows or writing tell-all books. He is just living, quietly, on his terms. And that silence says more than any interview could. It says he chose peace over applause, privacy over profit. That, maybe the only happy ending left for a child actor, is to become someone the world forgets. It is easy to think of these stars as lost, but maybe they are not lost at all. Maybe they just escaped. And in Michael's case, maybe disappearing was the bravest thing he ever did. If one of these stars stayed in your heart, share a memory below, tap like, and subscribe for more stories worth remembering.